All right. So I was asking my last video about how do you know when you go too far with something like this, or one of your hot rods or whatever, as to where it just becomes a garage queen and never drive it, and it just doesn't become fun anymore. So I guess we'll go back to when I was younger and still lived at home with my parents, and was a teenager. And the rule in my household was my sister and I were not allowed to have a V8 in anything that we drove while we lived under my father's house. So, his house, his rules. So, at the time, I had a 66 Mustang that he got me. And it was the first one I had. I was 12 or 13, and it was a rust bucket. The typical Mustang rear quarters. It had a vinyl roof, and it kind of looked like this C10 here with that rusted out and everything. So it was junk, and it was an original 6-cylinder car. So back then, the Mustangs, if they were 6-cylinder, they were 4-lug, and if they were V8, they were 5-lug. The suspension was different, and you had a different rear end and everything. So he had bought another 66 Mustang that was a V8 car, had a 289 C4 in it, and then he bought a 68 coupe that was a running driving car. And so because the 66 he had was, it was a lot of work to be done, and he doesn't get things done like I do. So anyway, he gave me that 66. I sold the other 66 and then used that money to put into the V8 66. So he made me pull the drivetrain out, the 289 C4, put it in his 68, and get it all running for him. And he made me put the 206 cylinder in the V8 car. So it was an automatic car. I switched it out to a T10 4-speed. Found all the linkage and everything, which I don't know how I was able to find all that, but had the Z-bar thing that bolted to the frame rail and went to the engine block, and then had the mechanical linkage and everything to work the clutch, and actually found a bell housing to go from the T10 to the 6-cylinder. And it was, a lot of work, a lot of sourcing parts and stuff like that. And back then, you really didn't have a way to find all that like we do now with the internet and all. So, but luckily there was a local guy he was real big into Mustangs and had all that stuff. So we were able to get it so I could put that car together. So, so with the 200 straight six, I put a comp cam in it. I put electric fuel pump. I had a Clifford header. I think that thing was like $400 or something. And then I put had a 2 1/4 exhaust with a Flowmaster Delta Series or something. The car sounded really good. Had a little bump to it. I took the 1-barrel carburetor off. Put the Clifford 6=8 adapter that went from a 1-barrel that was probably about that big around to a 2300 base to put a 500 CFM Holley on it. And it got wonderful fuel mileage. And I think it ran a 17 something at not even 80 miles an hour in the quarter. And but it would smoke that one tire, being a stick shift. And I switched out the rear end, the 8 inch. It was just an 8 inch. I put a Richmond 355 in it. And when I graduated high school, I took all my graduation money and I built a 408 Windsor. And I forget really. I think I put it in a 96 Mustang first. Had a T5 in it, and something really bad happened with that. We won't go into all those details. And that was 20 years ago. And so then that engine and transmission ended up in my 66 Mustang. And the 66 platform just sucked for that 408 and the T5 and everything. It just the car didn't really handle it that well. So I can't really remember what all I did, but anyway, I had a Fairmont, two-door box top Fairmont, and I ran it in NMRA in early 2000s, and on my birthday, and it had a 302 in it, I think, with a C4, and it was, just a gutted race car, and somehow the 408 and stick shift ended up in that car, and so I was, I wanted something I could drive on the street. So I got a 94 GT Mustang, and it was a very, very clean car. Silver with black interior. And it was my buddy's car. And he got the car. I mean, I think it was like a really low mileage car, very well kept car. I mean, it was a nice car. For back then, and it was a stick shift car, and he had bought a blower to put on the stock 302 and everything in it, and had bought a bunch of parts because he was a Honda guy and had sold a bunch of his little Honda stuff and bought all this stuff, and for some reason my friend at the time talked him into building a 351 Windsor for the car. So a boosted 302 versus an NA 351. So I don't know why he thought that was a better way to go. But anyway, he sold the blower and all that stuff and built a 351. And he would worry himself into situations he didn't need to be in, like a get rag, rear diff failing on a IRS car. But so he was scared to death of this. He was scared to death of that. He thought that the crank had to be turned like 10-10 or something like that, and he just knew it was going to break in half, and he was just a worry wart. Scared the T5 was going to break. He went to a C4 with like a really, really, really loose converter. I think it was like an edge converter, and I think it flashed to like 5,000 or something. They missed that converter by a mile. I mean, it was just horrible, not having lockup and not having overdrive. I don't remember what rear end was under it. I know it was an 8.8, but I don't remember the gear ratio. But the other problem is going from the 302 to the 351. Back then, you really didn't have a whole lot of option as far as tuning a Ford. You didn't have the Holley Terminator. You didn't have Holley back then was a carburetor, so you had to do a custom chip. And I remember taking the computer apart, and you had to scrub the contacts off to plug the chip in, and I think it was Diablo or something, so it had little horns on it, and you actually had to cut them off for it to fit all the way in the computer. So why would you put the horns on it? But anyway. So I remember it had 30-pound injectors, and he always thought that was the problem. But the tuning and everything of the car was just horrible. It just never ran right. And then with the loose converter and no overdrive, he was done with the car. So he ended up being like a, no offense to anyone, but like a kayaker, mountain bike, woods type guy now, whatever that is. But I used to ride mountain bikes as a kid too, but anyway, he got all into that, and that's his passion now, and good for him. So good for him, because I got the 94 GT Mustang, and but that's what killed it for him was the tuning. It didn't run and drive well, and then the no overdrive, the big stall converter. I mean, it was turning so many RPM to run down the road. And I don't know if he still had air conditioning, or I really don't remember all the specifics from back then. But when I got the car, again, I put the 408 in it, and I had a TKO 600. Sometime around the early 2000s, I had a TKO 600 I put in it. And again, back then, you really didn't have a whole lot of options that I knew of anyway, for a good clutch that would hold anything. And the 408, it was like a 10.5-to-1 engine, AFR heads. It was carbureted. It had a Victor Jr. or something on it with I think it had a Demon carburetor on it or something. And again, I don't remember what gear ratio I had in it, but it was a fun car to drive. Had 315, 35, 17s on the back with a 10.5-inch, with the wide lip on it and everything. And they were bullet style wheels or something. The car looked great. It was a good looking car. And I think it was about 3,300 pound car. And if I remember correctly, it ran 1080s or something. And I don't remember if I drove it to the track or if we trailered it, or I don't remember all the specifics, but I remember running like a 1080 with it, and I had tubular front end under it. That was like the first generation AJE, and it like broke the control arm at the pivot point on the bottom, and it was just a mess. So they did send me a new one. But I remember that break-in, and I had coilovers on it, on UPR coilovers on the front, and, just all that stuff. And then, so I think in an effort to get to the 1080s, maybe, I started gutting the car, taking out stuff that, from here to here to get, if it didn't need it to go fast, it came off the car. And then it became, it was still a nice street car and everything, but, at the time, since we were going to the drag strip and all, 1080s wasn't fast enough. So that's when I sold that 408 and just got rid of the 408, the 6-speed, the car. It had 410s when I had a 6-speed, and I put a T56 out of a Camaro in it, and the 6 gear in those was 0.5, and with the 410s and the height tires on it, 90 was about 2,000 RPM, and it kind of lugged to pull that. So basically 6 gear was useless, and I wanted to go faster, so I ended up buying a Mercury Zephyr box top, and for $500 had a QA1 tubular K member, which those moved the wheelbase an inch forward or something. They were weird. I don't know why they did that, but anyway, I built that into a race car. I built a 418 Windsor, 13.5-to-1, 700 lift solid roller, AFR 225s. It was a Super Victor, and then I had a Pro Systems carb on it, and I had a Power Glide, a PTC converter, 355 rear, had a 26x10 on a 10 on the back, and the car would do like 120, 160 foots. Had 2 kits on it, had a plate and a fogger. Car weighed about 2,600 pounds with me in it, and so I get the car together, and it became a race car. It was a race car. It didn't become one. It always was one. And then I was like, well, the only time I get to use this is when I go to the track. So I didn't like that. And, 13.5-to-1 compression. I was on ethanol. I would run straight E98 in it. And so then, so we went from a 94 GT Mustang I could drive on the street and everything, but it wasn't fast enough, to the Zephyr that it still really wasn't fast enough. It was like a mid 5-second car back then. And by today's standards, that's pathetically slow. But, I, as a person with my income and whatever, being young, I couldn't compete with those guys. There were guys at the track. That was about the time that they started pulling together, how many people would come together and put their money together and put a car together. And, you couldn't screw with that. You'd have cars that would look like complete junk, and they'd have like 700 cubic inch Fulton motors in them that made a bunch of power, And around here, there's a lot of grudge cars and stuff around here. We used to go to Twiggs Twiggs County, they had a track. It was called Twigs, and then they had one in Reynolds. It was called Silver Dollar, and that's where I ran my Fairmont and NMRA. But so got rid of the Zephyr, and well, I kept the Zephyr. I think I sold. That's when I went LS. So I sold the 418, all the stuff associated with 418, the Power Glide, and all that stuff. I kept the, well, actually, I put a single no, I did a twin turbo setup in it first with a 4L80, and, again, it had full race suspension in the back, but for back then it had, all solid heim joints and bushings, and front was tubular Team Z, had a Team Z front end under it, skinny kid plates, and I mean, it was race car. And I tried to turn it into a street car, and I did drive it. I would drive it to the track and then run it and everything. And then I was like, man, this sucks to drive on the street. So I got an 86 LTD, and then took the drivetrain out of the Zephyr and put it all in there, because I liked how well that the LTD was a nice, clean cream puff, and I really liked driving it on the street. But then, if you're not seeing a pattern already, I took it way too far. It ended up with all solid bushings and everything in the back, coilovers in the front, gutting it to try to get all the weight out of it I could. I drove it to the track, and I had a 16 injector intake on it, so it would run. I could drive around on pump gas, and then the other injectors would turn on under power, and so that way I could drive around and stop at any gas station, because we don't have E85 around here, so I can't just stop anywhere and fill up with E85. So that's why I did the dual fuel setup like that. And then initially it was a nice car, fun to drive, and then it wasn't because it was boosted or anything. Like the suspension, now was race car, everything was solid, bushings and heim joints, and it just again became a race car. So I wanted something I could drive on the street. So then I got that's when I got into Caprice. So my first Caprice, I built my own turbo setup, and I had the turbo right here, which those cars were very tight. Of course, now that I have a CTS-V, that car's even tighter. So anyway, I had a turbo here and made everything fit, and the car ran good. And then I didn't do anything on the suspension or anything. Everything still worked and whatnot. And then entered the white Caprice. That was actually supposed to be for my customer. I made a mistake on it. It was my fault. I tore it up. So anyway, to make things right with the customer, he wanted to go boost it anyway, so he ended up with my first Caprice, and then I got the white Caprice. So after I got the white Caprice, it didn't have an engine because I made a boo-boo, and I had a single turbo LTD sitting beside it, so I pulled the drivetrain out of it, the engine and all, put it in the Caprice, and then the money I got from the deal with him, I put the twin turbos on it and everything, and then we had a 1,000 horsepower car, and and it had all the modern amenities. It had power steering, which the LTD had power steering. It did not have air conditioning. It did have heat, but this is Georgia, and it sucks to not have air conditioning. So with the Caprice, it had air conditioning, and I wanted a 4-door car because I have a wife and children, so I wanted to be able to drive them in it. So the Caprice, it was a fun car, but there were just little things about it that I didn't like working on it. I hated working on it when I had to work on it. And I mean, it was just, Once I get to a point where basically I don't like the car, that's kind of the end of it for me. I'm done with it. So the Zephyr, was a race car, and then when it became a street car, all the race cars sucked about it. The cage, it had a cage in it. That was one of my only vehicles to have a cage in it. Then with the LTD, I would try to run in the daily driver classes, sue me. And it loosely fit the criteria, and there's two types of racers, cheaters and losers. And it loosely fit the criteria. And I wasn't the fastest one in the class either, so I would run in it. But then they started stipping rules on me, where I basically put my car out of the class and whatever. And it was I just started seeing a pattern with that, and I didn't like that. And that was really the end of my drag strip career. I haven't been to the drag strip since, really. No, I haven't. I used to have a blast. I'd drive the car out there and make some passes, and then one night they had a no prep thing, and I was down there. I drove it down there on some Hoosier drag radials, or no, they were bias plies. I forget what they're called, but QuickTime Pros. I was on Hoosier QuickTime Pros, and I had mini tubbed the LTD, and it was set up where I could do stock style suspension or coilover. And that thing, I don't know what the car ran because I didn't have my draggy back then. But man, that thing made a pass. And then when it came time to race, like nobody wanted to race me. So I don't know why, but I'm telling you, man, that thing was on a pass. It put it down. It ran good on that pass. I wish I knew what it ran. But anyway, I really didn't know what I was doing as far as the tuning of it, the chassis suspension setup. I really had no idea what I was doing. And I didn't have anybody knowledgeable enough to help me, or I wasn't smart enough to figure out what needed to happen and video, the back tire and see if it was spinning or hooking or squatting or separating or all that stuff. And again, I really didn't know about the tune-up on it. And this was before Michael had a dyno even. That's actually how we met. Was I had the LTD and he and I raced down at Twiggs, and that's how we actually met each other. But so the car was fast. I think it ran 580s at 120 or something. It was like 3,600 pounds or something like that. And but the white Caprice, it was just it just became problematic with just trying to get everything right and working on it, and it had little quirks about it that I didn't like. And it's if I can't fix it or figure it out, I just don't want anything to do with it. And it just builds and gets to a point where it's like that. Like my red truck, I can hop in it and drive it anywhere, and that's what I want. Is I had a 85 LTD that I built. It was identical to the 86. They were both white 4-doors. And I put a LS1, a true LS1 I bought a 2000 Z28 Camaro, and just put the whole drivetrain in the 85 LTD, put an 8.8 in it, put a 355 gear in it, got a set of long tubes off scratch and dent, built a cobble together, 3-inch Y pipe into a single 3-inch into a Jones muffler with a turn down. And I had a TCI converter I got off scratch and dent for $200 or something. And that car, it was about 3,400 pound car. It had steel wheels on it off a Dodge Magnum. And I actually widened the back wheels to a 17x9, and the fronts were 17x7, I think. And it looked, it was a good looking car. I like how it turned out. And you hit the key, fire it up, drive it anywhere. I actually put 1,000 miles on it like the week I built it. So like I built the 8.8 on a Monday, put it in the car, drove it the next day, a couple hundred miles to a job site. And then a couple days later was Thanksgiving for the turkey rod run, and then drove it all the way down to Lakeland, Florida. My wife's in-laws were, and then spent time with them, and then drove it across to Daytona, and then from Daytona back to Middle Georgia. So, I mean, and it got almost 22 miles a gallon. And then I did take it to the track one time, but they got rained out. So I didn't get to make a pass. But the guy that ended up getting it, he took it to the track. And the car ended up running bottom 12s. I mean, I was very surprised because it had stock camshaft, 241 heads, a 4L60 that I had built, a 355 rear end and everything. But that was a fun little car. You could just hop in it and drive it anywhere. It had bone stock suspension under it. And, the tune was close enough that it ran and drove very well. And, but it did not have air conditioning because I just didn't get that motivated to do it. And, so those are kind of the things that kill it for me as far as from turning it into a fun daily driver street car into, something I don't want anything to do with. And that's harsh riding suspension, no modern conveniences, like air conditioning, and you got to have a radio. You got to have heat, power steering, overdrive, lockup converter, and then like the interior. I didn't like the interior on the Caprice. I had done the G8 console. It had SS seats, but it had the cop car mats in it, and it just it was a 12, so everybody that in the Caprice world, it's got to be a 14 and up, or they don't want anything to do with it. I haven't had the opportunity to drive one or be in one. I'm sure they're nice, but or nicer than the G8 interior Caprice. But anyway, so that's kind of my take on it as to what ultimately turns one into something fun, that you drive and enjoy, into something that you just don't want anything to do with and just sell at any cost. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's my take on it.